So good afternoon. I think it's 12:08, so we can say good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to this next session of the ESPAS conference. It's optimistically entitled War in Europe Towards Victory in Ukraine and Lasting Security. So we've heard just now from our very prestigious panel right before on the incidents, the reactions, the NATO and EU plans, actions and forward look regarding the war in Ukraine. But in this panel we're going to have 5 excellent experts to focus on the security and defense implications of the war on Ukraine, on transatlantic cooperation, on European Union, NATO cooperation, and how that is forming out, changing, being affected and being influenced by the war on Ukraine, and what we should be thinking about going forward, given recent events, given potential scenario and outlooks. How will Europe secure its own security, how will it support security in Ukraine, and how will the transatlantic community continue to build security in the European space going forward. Now this is one of 3 panels in a sequence on security and defense. We've just had the Deputy Secretary General of NATO and the Secretary General of the External Action Service discuss on the same topic. We're now having our panel of experts, and this will be followed by a panel on transatlantic cooperation for security in the Indo-Pacific, which we must not forget in this context, and maybe we'll touch on this. But just to introduce the panel in itself, this panel comes from a realization that we are in a moment which is perhaps a moment of change and turn in the war on Ukraine. We've seen the retreat from Kherson, but we've also seen missile attacks. We're 9 months into the war, something that sometimes is even surprising to think, because we're almost reaching to a year of it. We've seen tremendous and unprecedented action, as we've heard from the previous panelists, both from the EU and NATO in terms of sanctions, humanitarian support, microfinancial assistance, but perhaps most importantly for this panel today, in the support of the Ukrainian military through the supply of weapons, lethal assistance. The EU yesterday set up the new military advisory mission. There's been a new assistance measure under the European Peace Facility to support the delivery of weapons, and NATO continues to be extremely involved and leading in this process. We've seen multilateral cooperation through the G7, the G20 and other formats, and Vice President Šefčovič spoke to this effect. But we're also thinking about the future, the potential problems that will arise from the depletion of resources, both financial but also military, which has come up in the previous panel. And we're looking forward with a sense of having an urgency to understand the potential scenario so that both organizations, the EU and NATO, can prepare. We've heard a lot about preparedness in the previous panels. We cannot predict. I think this was made clear in the speech of Prime Minister Plenković, but we can prepare. And I think this tunes in very well with the sense of the ESPAS conference and foresight. Now, to discuss all these issues today, we have an excellent panel of colleagues who I also dare call friends, many of whom we've interacted with in previous months on these same topics. We'll begin with Alina Frolova, who is the Deputy Chairperson of the Center for Defense Studies, but also former Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. We have Benedetta Berti joining us in person, Head of Policy Planning in the Office of Secretary General at NATO, also very much involved in the formulation of the new strategic concept. Kristi Reich, also online, Director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. She has also been a collaborator of our service, the European Parliamentary Research Service, in a number of events we have held. Dick Zandi, Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Security Unit at the Klingendal Institute, and previously also involved in policy planning at the European Defence Agency. And finally, last but not least, another close partner of the European Parliamentary Research Service, Gustav Lindström, Director of the EU Institute for Security Studies, and also the part of the steering board of ESPAS. So we have really 5 excellent experts with us to discuss this all-important topic. Before I start with a short round of initial comments, I want to remind everyone that as in the previous panels, we will be taking questions physically in the room once our first discussion is completed, but also that you can use Slido in the room through your phones, but also those of you who are watching online to ask questions that we will later take. Now, to kick off the conversation, I want to welcome warmly Alina Frolova. She's joining us from Poland, I believe, today. You wrote Alina, not Ukraine. And maybe to ask you first, what is Ukraine expecting from the European Union and NATO in the coming months? What is the perception and what is the reaction to the support that has been received? What should we in the European Union and NATO be doing with regard to aid, both military, humanitarian, financial, any aspects you want to come in on?
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting. And I'd like to say that I'm like a cat from the train. Because due to all these latest effects, we have like a massive.
Alina, we're having a bit of a problem hearing you. So maybe I'll let you work on your connection since we are moving quickly in time, and I'll move on to the next speaker very quickly. But we'll come back to you as soon as your connection is reestablished to hear that all-important view from Ukraine. And so then I will move to Benedetta Berti. Welcome again, Benedetta. You were very much involved in the drafting and preparation of the new NATO strategic concept, which leaders agreed on in Madrid this summer. But obviously that process began before the war on Ukraine. So I wanted to ask, with what we know now, what reaction did NATO have to the war? How was this integrated in the concept? And looking forward, what will be those challenges of implementation arising from the situation and the war in Ukraine?
Thank you. Yeah, and great question as ever. I didn't expect anything else from you, so I'll try to be very brief because I know we have a lot of expertise packed into a relatively short time. But this is a question I've heard many times. In other words, we had already written a first draft of the strategic concept prior to the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And one of the initial questions was, did you have to actually rewrite the document? Did this horrific event change the analysis? And the really short answer to that is no. Unfortunately, it did not, meaning that when we had the first draft at the end of 2021, we were pretty much working on one assumption, and the assumption is actually the one of your conference. Geopolitics is back. Our security environment has been deteriorating quite dramatically and systematically for at least a decade. And we don't exactly know what the configuration of the new security environment will look like, but we have three main trends that we see as defining the global security environment generally, and more specifically the Euro-Atlantic one. And those were persistent fragility, recurring shocks, and strategic competition. So those were our three leitmotif in the pre-war draft. And the reality is that all of these three trends, I would say, are still very much key to understanding how our environment is shifting. So in that sense, no, there wasn't a strategic shift. And even when it comes to Russia, we were already looking at a consistent deterioration of our relationship with Russia that had really been ongoing for many years. And from a military perspective, I would say the wake-up call, the strategic shift, really is 2014 in the annexation of Crimea, because after the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, our military planners and then our political, driven by our political decision makers, of course, really looked at the reality and say we're no longer in the same environment. We need to prepare, reset ourselves to do collective defense, to do territorial defense, and really put deterrence and defense back at the center of how we look at our security in a way that we hadn't done for decades. So in that sense, I know we have to be very brief, but I think it's important to start to say that unfortunately the strategic picture was already looking very much grim before February. That say, I think that we can look at this war, which is still very much ongoing. So to a certain extent, it's difficult to draw the final conclusions until we know what a quote-unquote political settlement will look like, which I think we're very far from knowing. But we can definitely look at this at least as a culmination of a trend when it comes to our relationship with Russia. I would say we can look at this as possibly the final chip in the post-Cold War European security order, whose principle and norms have been violated for years. But I think after this, we can talk about this war in that sense as a watershed. That order has been violated, compromised to the point that it doesn't work anymore, and we'll have to build something else. And the status quo ante, to me, doesn't exist. It was shattered along with peace in Europe when Putin invaded Crimea. So I start with that because I know that we're very strict on time. Happy to elaborate.
Thank you, and thank you for respecting the time. And you've given me a very good pass because I want to turn to Dick Zandi next and welcome him, but also to echo some of the things you said. So strategic competition, thinking about the 2014 annexation of Crimea still being a de facto reality. This has all fed into processes of the EU thinking about its military identity and its development of its security and defense policy throughout the time between 2014 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've also seen in a previous ESPAS report that this was already there, so it didn't come from nowhere, this trend. But Dick, I want to hear from you what you think about how the actual invasion has affected the EU's thinking about its military identity, about its security and defense policy, and whether what has been agreed to be delivered is enough or should more be done.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. First, let me say I completely agree with Benedetta on the fact that the war in Ukraine is not a game changer. I call it a sort of a super accelerator of things that were already ongoing, starting, of course, with the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, which was a real game changer, I think, in 2014. And actually what we have seen as a result of the war is all contrary to Putin's agenda. NATO is strengthened and has a huge program, enhanced forward presence, the new NATO force model. We are accelerating our decrease of energy dependency on Russia, and we see a further transitioning to green energies and so forth. Now, your question, what does it mean for the EU? Has the EU responded correctly or up to its mark in terms of the defense, security and defense effort? I think so, yes. Leaving to the side the whole issue of sanctions, of course, what we have seen are all the initiatives of the Commission to use the European Peace Facility first for financing the weapons deliveries of member states to Ukraine, 3.1 billion by now, which is 2/3 of the EPF. This immediately raises the question of the size of the fund. And we have seen more recently, of course, the initiatives of starting even to finance procurement programs. All of that was completely unthinkable about 4, 5, 6 years ago, or even perhaps 2 years ago. So these are tremendous changes, I think, in terms of the EU acting in the defense field. Another thing, of course, is to look at what member states are doing. I was quite shocked this week when I saw the new CARD report from the European Defence Agency, which concludes that of course, this is looking back to 2021, so it's 1 year behind, and that the member states are actually still not fulfilling the target of realizing more collaborative procurement programs. So hopefully the Commission's new initiative will also help to realize that effect in the future. And this is still worrying. If I look at the way the rising defense budgets are spent in the member states, most of it is immediately going to all kinds of national priorities and national programs. So I think here the change of mindset in the member states is still required. The tools that are available are there. They have been there for many years. But the CARD report simply concludes that the tools are still not optimally used and not inserted into the planning processes in the capitals. So the answer to the question is, I think the EU collectively has responded well. I still have my doubts about the behavior of the member states.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll get back to these industrial elements later on in the panel, because they are a trend to follow, I think, both for NATO member states and EU members. But you've mentioned capitals and member states quite a bit, and I think this is a good opportunity to now turn to Kirsti Reich. Welcome. Because obviously, preceding 2022, one concern about the future of the EU security and defense architecture and policy was diverging views among capitals. And Kirsti, you have looked at the European security initiatives from the Baltic state perspective. You are based there. And of course, that is also very much in the line of fire, very close to the war at the moment. So I wondered, from the perspective of the Baltic states, how do you see the future of European security given the geopolitical developments, given Russia's war on Ukraine, and how do you evaluate the steps made and the EU's contribution?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and happy to join. Looking at it from, let's say, the eastern flank, eastern member states of the EU and NATO. Of course, the response of both organizations, the EU and NATO, to Russia's war against Ukraine has been very significant. And especially the EU has been surprisingly strong and clear in its response, and has taken important steps to really become a stronger security actor and geopolitical actor, contributing in its own way to European security. And interestingly, the contribution of NATO has been somewhat of a disappointment to Ukraine, but that's of course because NATO has been focusing understandably on strengthening defense and deterrence of its member states, while it's then individual countries, NATO countries, that have been assisting Ukraine and helping it defend itself. Now, on more specifically on the EU's contribution, I mean, during the past years, we had a lot of debates on European strategic autonomy. And as you know, I mean, the Baltic states were always the more skeptical ones. I think we can say now that the war has shown very clearly how strongly European security does depend on the US, looking at how much more significant the US military assistance has been in comparison to European assistance, which is also significant, but clearly smaller, primarily because Europeans just don't have as many capabilities that they could use in a situation of war. But then there are also, to some extent, political considerations, or political reasoning is different in European countries. But now looking ahead, I think the key question really for both the EU and NATO is, and that's what the previous speaker was also referring to, is whether member states actually take this situation now seriously. We've heard many commitments from European countries to increase defense spending. We have also heard a lot of talk also in this event today about the need for complementarity between the EU and NATO. Rather than just talking about whether the EU can one day become autonomous, I think the core question in the near future is whether member states actually get serious with strengthening their defense capabilities, which then will one day enable Europe to be more autonomous. But it's a long process, a lot of work still to be done. And from, let's say, the Baltic perspective, and not only the Baltic states, it's still NATO that is the primary framework for this work of strengthening European defense. But I do see scope for strengthening the contribution of the EU now that member states are spending more, and there is clearly need for more coordination. There is potential to use the EU's defense instruments and defense cooperation in the EU framework more extensively than so far. And it's something that in the end benefits then both the EU and NATO. Thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you, Christy. And I'm some very good points there. Also, interestingly, you mentioned the reaction of Ukraine and the perception in Ukraine of the support efforts. And I'm glad to see we have Alina Frolova back with us from the train. So maybe, Alina, just to update you, we've talked about the NATO contribution to support from Ukraine. We've talked about the EU's actions and strengthening its defense identity. And Christy has referred to the need, of course, for looking forward coordination and coordinating the support, including to deliver to Ukraine what it will need for this next phase of the war. So we're very much at a good time for you to come in and let us know how is this looking from Ukraine and what do you see looking forward? How do you evaluate the debates in Europe about the kind of weaponry that is needed, the kind of support that is needed going forward? I'm afraid we cannot hear you. Could this be just a mute?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. First of all, I would like to say that from the previous discussion, I've heard what the Deputy Secretary General said, that the front line is freezed, and I think that this is not the right position because actually the line is not freezed, and I believe that before New Year we will see like a substantial moves of Ukrainian army, and we need to be prepared to it, and the Europe needs to be prepared to it, and our partners, because this is not only about the weapons supply, this is also about the scoping of the security configuration in Europe and in the world. So the first point is that we really do need more advanced weapon and in bigger amount. That's first, but everyone knows this. The second, we need probably to understand that this is not the time now for negotiations, and that should be somehow considered also because we hear different voices about this. And from my discussion with European politicians, I know that still, for example, the release of Crimea is taken as a separate part of the story, but not the general, a story of the territories which could be released. And the third one, I think that very important to start to discuss how we will shape the world after the war, because here is...
We have lost you again.
Question is the word. Do you hear me?
We lost you for a second.
Hi.
Alina, if you can hear us, we heard your point about weapons deliveries, about no time for negotiations, but there was a third point that we didn't manage to hear.
Yeah, the third point is about the future of the security shaping, and we need to start discussion about what Russia will be and how the whole world will influence on this process, because we should understand that if we will just isolate us from the decision making about the future of Russia, we will face with the next phase of war in a few years. That's inevitable because Russia still stays in this agenda of colonialism and territorial and offensive warfare need to be raised up. I believe that not only weapons plays, but also some kind of political decisions which should be made, should be also discussed.
Thank you for that. And that's a couple of points I definitely want to get back to the other speakers on in the next minutes. But first, I'll turn to our last speaker, Gustav Lindström. Gustav, you've been director of the European Union Institute for Security Studies throughout this I would say rather unforeseen situation of a war in Europe. And you've also worked closely with those who were drafting the strategic compass and written on this. We haven't mentioned that in detail now, but your evaluation of the strategic compass, a document that was endorsed by the leaders of the EU in March and very much sets the direction for the EU security and defense policy in light of the current geopolitical environment. Please do share that with us. And do you think that the strategic compass is a document fit for purpose at the moment for what the EU should be doing with regard to the war in Ukraine and a general security environment?
Thank you very much, Elena. And let me briefly touch upon your question. Let's remind ourselves the strategic compass is guidance for European security and defense for the 5 to 10 years. So it had a long-term vision. And of course, there were many changes made before the document came out, given what happened on 24 February. So if we look at it today and we look at the implementation rate of the strategic compass, what is interesting to note is that, as you know, there are 81 strategic objectives. And these have a 10-year time frame. But of those 81 objectives, 53 of them should achieve great progress by the end of this year. And from my perspective, I would say that there is good progress on these 53 objectives. Let's remind ourselves that some of them are more complex than others. This includes progress on rapid deployment capability, progress on new toolboxes, foreign information manipulation and interference, on hybrid threats. So there are a lot of elements, and we have seen good progress. At the same time, we have seen progress on very important related issues. We just had the Military Mobility Action Plan updated and released just the other day. We just had the CARD report that Dick Sandee referenced, where, of course, there are some signals about things that still need to be improved. And maybe I will, having said now that progress is ongoing, that there was an adaptability to what is happening in the Ukraine, and I think there were references to the European Peace Facility and how that instrument had to be adapted very quickly. But we have some work to be done. I think defense investments was mentioned, and here the expectation is that member states will try to increase the amounts, recognizing that it is quite complex given all the other competing demands for limited resources. But the CARD report noted this, and the expectation now is that perhaps there will be 70 billion additional euros in defense expenditures by 2025. We also heard that there is a need to spend more in common projects, and again, the CARD report mentions that there were about 18% of projects were done in common. This is a low figure. It's very similar to the 2020 CARD report, which was at 19%. Just to look ahead very quickly, and then I'll finish, is as we look ahead, we have some exciting things on the horizon. One of them is the expectation that next year there will be a European strategy on security and defense in space. We also have expectations for an update in the European Maritime Security Strategy. And as has been referenced, we have seen that there are expectations for continued work to facilitate joint procurement. And there's this temporary instrument known as EDIRPA that is supposed to reinforce European defense industry joint procurement. So there's a lot of things on the horizon, and again, trying to adjust to the situation given what we have geopolitically at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustav. At this point, I'd like to remind the audience that you can already be asking questions on Slido, and we'll be taking them very shortly. In the meantime, I'll get back to the panelists for a second round of questions, just based on what's been said, because I wonder, and thinking of ESPAS's mission of looking forward, Benedetta, to you, the issue of Russia's future has been brought up by Alina, and I wonder, in the NATO mindset and in the NATO leaders' conversations, is that coming up, and how is NATO preparing for a future Russia?
I had a feeling you would be asking me that. No, I will. It's clearly a very complex conversation, but I would highlight perhaps a few points in terms of what I believe is a helpful way to think about how do we prepare, right? And I think one element I would put on the table is no matter what, we need to prepare for a long term of instability in our near neighborhood. I think that's a relatively plain insight, but I don't know how much we have internalized it and operationalized it in the way we make in our decision making and long-term strategic planning. By which I mean that sometimes I do still hear elusive references to a day after where everything will be okay, and I don't want to be the spoiler of that. But at the same time, my job when I am as policy planning is to plan for all types of contingencies. But I think my central assumption, and it might be erroneous, but it is that this elusive day after, it's not going to come. There's going to be, we are in a transition from one security order to another, and there's going to be a bumpy ride that is going to have an impact on our own security, on our own societies, on our neighborhood, and therefore I hesitate to visualize what does that day after look like on Russia. Certainly there's a number of contingencies we must prepare for, weaker, divided, fragile, wounded, all of these, and we are thinking about those. And then, of course, a lot of this depends on the outcome of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the parameters of when the guns fall silent, what is on the ground. That conversation I really hesitate to get involved with in public, because I think we have someone from Ukraine on this panel. I think that question of what are the expectations for to go back to the title of this panel, which is Victory in Ukraine, I would defer to our Ukrainian colleagues, who are the ones actually on the battlefield fighting for their own existence. And so I would rather hear from them what the view of victory is like than from me. But we are preparing and then I'll stop because I know time is very short, but I think policy-wise, the recommendation is prepare for long time instability, build up your resilience, understand that maintaining our steadfast support for Ukraine, both through military support, but also through political support and also through maintaining sanctions, that's going to be essential. And of course, the more time goes by, the more it will be difficult. So we need to build in resilience in our policy making and decision making. I know it's not something that I'm sure everyone in the room has thought about it as well, but that would be my first point on this reflection.
Thank you for that, Benedetta, and an example of a very good NATO-EU coordination, because I was about to turn to Alina, who I hope is still there, to ask what should be the developments that Ukrainians are preparing for the next coming months, especially thinking about winter. And someone from the online audience has also asked this question. What are you expecting the next months to look like for Ukraine in terms of military developments, but also energy issues, financial needs?
Well, actually, I don't think that somehow winter will influence on the plans, on operational plans of Ukraine. I think that the issues which can influence this is the intelligence results, and this is the results of previous campaigns. And from what we see now, we are continuing the operation on the south actively, and this south operation should bring results, and these results would be just like a cut of supplies and cut of connection with Crimea. And what would be the next direction? I think that our commons will choose whether they want to have a look at Crimea or to pay more attention to Lugansk, Donetsk region. But obviously there could be operational pauses, which is not now, but I don't think that someone will stop because of winter. And this is principle. So what we see from the point of view of weapons and support and supplies, I think that from the weapons point of view, a lot of ideas were put on table during Rammstein, and I'm absolutely sure that officially it's negotiated quite hardly. But obviously what we need, this is a long-range offensive capability, because what we're suffering now, and you are suffering now, this is the missiles attacks, and this is launch of these missiles are done from Russian and Belarusian territory, and we need to have a capability also to deal with these attacks and to minimize them. But the support of economy is also important, because we perfectly understand that Ukrainian economy is ruined, and we need to hold on. As for the future and looking at the future, we do understand that we will win. That's obviously. We, with greater support, will win quite much faster and with less losses. And this is principle for us, like our people and our territories. And but we need to really think about the shape and the configuration of security. And I think that this future map of security will be less centralized, more regional, more connected to the regional security and activation of smaller political nations.
Thank you for that. Thinking of winter scenario and potential, then the way the months ahead will look, I want to turn to Christy, because there is a question on Slido, but also my own, which is that the states of the Eastern European states, member states of the EU, and those who are closer to the epicenter of the war in the Baltics and Eastern Europe, are facing a heightened threat according to some scenarios. So I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about that. Does the threat feel bigger? And does that mean that they're looking to the EU to deliver faster, perhaps on some of the elements of the compass or others?
Thank you for the question. Well, I would not say that we sense an immediate increased threat in the Baltic states. Now the focus is very much on doing everything we can to assist Ukraine. And of course, in countries that are neighboring to Russia and closer to Ukraine geographically, this understanding is even stronger than in, let's say, Western parts of Europe, that Ukraine's fate will have an existential importance for our own security. And it's a very strong understanding in our societies that Ukraine's victory in this war will have really far-reaching consequences for the future of European security and also for the future of Russia. So if I can refer back to what Benedetta was saying earlier, very much agree that we have to prepare for years of a difficult antagonistic relationship with Russia, no matter how quickly the war ends. This is something that the Estonian leaders have been making very clearly, the point that Russia has to be clearly defeated. And as a result of this defeat, looking at Russia's history over the past centuries, there is the possibility that a clear military defeat will lead to some kind of major transformation inside Russia, which of course is not necessarily something very positive from the perspective of Russia's neighbors. We can expect also a period of instability. But what is important is to acknowledge that for now, for many years to come, we actually don't have a common understanding with Russia on a European security order. There are profound disagreements, and those will not necessarily disappear when Putin's regime will fall. But we can have the same issue also with the next leadership. So the key issue now for Europe and the Euro-Atlantic community is to strengthen the Western security structures, the Euro-Atlantic security structures, both in the NATO and EU framework, and to integrate Ukraine into these structures. Because then in the longer term, if Ukraine will be successfully integrated to Europe and will be a democracy, it will have also an impact on Russian society, but that's a longer term perspective. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Christy. You mentioned Euro-Atlantic cooperation, transatlantic cooperation, and that has been, according to many accounts, unprecedented. But Digzandi, I want to turn to you with the Slido question, again, also my own. In spite of that unprecedented coordination and cooperation, do you see any challenges as well for the transatlantic partnership going ahead? And you've mentioned defense industrial issues, which some see as a potential challenge. So if you could speak quickly to that point. In the meantime, let me tell the audience, if you have questions live as well, please do raise your hand and I'll take this as we move forward. But Digzandi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Well, America's back, I think, is the word spoken by President Biden. This is absolutely true. The war in Ukraine has brought the US back to Europe. In larger numbers than ever before after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But this is a temporary effect. One day the war in Ukraine will be over, and we've seen the national security strategy released 2 weeks ago in the US, and that enemy number one is China, and this will not change. So we have to think in Europe about increasing our own efforts. We have to bring to the floor a larger part of the NATO output, and we have to prepare ourselves in case it is needed to act on our own. Now, you are right, the largest spoiler in the transatlantic cooperation can be the defense industrial aspect. We have seen the Americans opposing in the past efforts like the European Defense Fund and others, which of course are aimed at strengthening Europeans' defense and technological and industrial base, which can be contrary, of course, to Europe being the selling market for American defense companies. This topic has to be addressed in the transatlantic context. And at the moment, I don't see that it's taking place at all. So I think this is urgent to do because we have to look together with the Americans how we can be also in the industrial side more complementary and not just in the military output area, where the Americans, of course, are having an enormous transatlantic reinforcement capability in case there would be a war in Europe. But this also has an industrial aspect in it, and we haven't addressed that properly so far.
Thank you for this. On this note, I'll also turn to Gustav Lindström, because the strategic compass includes a quite important basket, as it is called, or pillar on partnerships. And I want to ask you how you see the actions foreseen under that pillar being affected by the war on Ukraine, both the transatlantic, but beyond that. What is necessary in terms of partnership for the EU defense actor to deliver on what it needs to deliver?
Sure. But if I may, maybe to add one more element to the last question, because I think many here in the room, and also I look at Benedetta, I think it's important to make a reference to both NATO and the EU and the importance it attaches to defense innovation. And now we have platforms on both sides with Diana within NATO, and we also have HEDI within the EU. So these are two acronyms, of course, but both are trying to really see how defense innovation can be maximized. And I think that's an important element to keep in mind as we look ahead. With respect to partnerships, this is, of course, crucial for the EU. It's one of the 4 key chapters or baskets of the strategic compass. And again, there are lots of different deliverables there, so there's a lot of emphasis. And perhaps looking forward, already in March of next year, there will be a very large gathering, a defense security forum, where there will be an opportunity to really put at display the partnerships and the importance of having exchanges on these issues. And I think there were references earlier today to the European political community. So there are different means and methods to try to keep these partnerships alive, but to also have the dialogue and conversations open. And for that reason, it's important not to just focus on one particular tool or process, but really to see these as different ways of having different conversations, sometimes simultaneously, on issues that are touching on security, but are also touching on strategic ideas, how to collaborate when it comes to industry, how to think about critical new technologies. So for those reasons, yes, there's a lot of activity, and there are also bilaterals with different partners. So this is ongoing. There's a lot to be said, but I think for now I will keep it to this. Thank you.
Thank you. And may I add, as we are sitting in this room, that this is also very much reflected in the European Parliament's relevance resolutions. So to add that point, but also interestingly, the new national security strategy of the United States, where I think the link between the partnership with Indo-Pacific and the European Union, Europe more widely, is accentuated. We have one question from the room. So please, sir, the floor is yours. If you can get a microphone. It's coming.
Thank you very much indeed. It's actually two very short questions for Benedetta, if I may say so.
If you might share with us who you are.
Oh, sure. My name is Michael Sanfey from the Policy Planning Unit of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. So Benedetta mentioned that the real wake-up call was the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and that policy planners looked at the reality and the need to do collective defence. So in the light of her saying that, I mean, could more have been done in the sense of heading off what actually happened? And then the second question is simply, she made a very interesting observation that the Ukraine war is a watershed and the old order, the current order, doesn't work anymore. So I just wonder, does she see implications in that for the United Nations system? Thanks very much.
Thank you for that. And this is also fortuitously a Slido question as well from the online audience. So, but to expand it a bit, what could the EU and NATO have done better in reacting to the Russian annexation of Crimea? So Benedetta, if you want to come in on this very briefly, and then maybe I'll ask one of the other speakers as well.
Sure, I'll try to be as brief as possible, given that it is a monumentally difficult question. But let me clarify a little bit more my remark on the wake-up call, and I stand by it. And what I mean is, from a military perspective, the political discussion, I think we were a little bit behind. But I think from a military planner's perspective, after the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, something clicked. It was very simple. It was, we had a few decades where we gradually de-emphasized de facto the importance of collective defense or territorial defense and deterrence and defense, because we thought it wouldn't have been as prominent on our list. But after you see on European soil, one country invade another sovereign countries and attempt to change borders by force, I think that really jump-started a real process of military adaptation. And I think that's really important to say, because had we not started that process in 2014 with the deployments of the enhanced forward presence, with the restructuring of our plans, I won't go too much into the list, but have we not done all that, there is no way that after that in February 2022, we would have been able to activate those plans within a few hours, to go from 4 to 8 battle groups, to bring within hours 30,000 troops under Secure's responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those steps were fundamental, and they marked the beginning. Now, after February, I think we had to make the decision, and I think it was the right one, that we need to set a new baseline. In other words, what we did between 2014 and 2022 was essential, but it's not sufficient. And now we're really moving much more towards a defend forward approach. That will take, let me be clear, this is a really generational, historic change that requires time to be completed. So I see a lot of more progress that needs to be done, but I think we identified the right direction. And then I'm not going to cop out of it. What could we have done? My impression, and I have to speak on a personal note on this, is that the magnitude of what happened in 2014 to many of our countries didn't really trigger down until much later. So I think for a while there was manage the crisis as an individual crisis type of approach, rather than recognize it as a symptom that the system as a whole was cracking. I think that political strategic wake-up call came in February, and I don't think we need to make that case anymore. Of course, you could have argued you should have seen it in 2014. Someone can say you should have seen it in 2008 with Georgia, or some can say you should have actually seen it in 2007 when President Putin went to the Munich Security Conference and actually told us the post-Cold War order doesn't work for us and we're going to do everything we can to change it. All of this is valid, but I also do not underestimate the magnitude of the strategic cultural change that we are going through as Europeans and North Americans. I'll stop here because I see time is ticking.
But if only we could use hindsight as foresight, but we can't, unfortunately. We are 2 minutes over, but we started 7 minutes over. So by my clock, we still have 5 minutes to go for this panel. Alina has raised her hand, probably to respond to this issue of how we handled the annexation of Crimea. But I'll put in one more question there from the online audience, which is essentially, have we had the correct strategy towards Belarus, both NATO and the EU? And should we be shifting attention to how we react and how we focus and engage or act on Belarus looking forward? So, Alina, you raised your hand, presumably on the Crimea issue, but if you want to come in on Belarus as well, please do, and then I'll turn to perhaps Kirsty on the same issue.
So I'd like just to make a smaller comment on what could be done in other way. And I think the two principal positions which should be changed. This is the strategic thinking, European strategic thinking should come again to reality, because what we saw in 2014 and what we saw in 2022, when everyone was sure that the invasion is like a issue of days, but there were any plan for sorry, I changed the location. There were any plan for how to cope with this. And this is the issue. Yes, we need to come back to reality and to even to those variants which we don't like. And this is the first point. The second point, this is obviously that NATO, for example, and Europe should start to understand their security not only limited with their borders, because what could be done in advance, the weapons can be like at least located at the borders with Ukraine to be ready to be delivered, and that should be a part of the policy. So I think that this is also a question which can be considered for the future. As for Belarus, I think that issue with Belarus is a little bit different, because still, from what we got, we understand that population mainly do not support the actions of Lukashenko. And this is like in Russia, population mainly supports the Putin activity. So I believe that Belarus has other case, and I believe that this is the issue of helping them to change the power in the country. And I believe that there are a lot of like Belarusians who are now serving in Ukrainian army and who are frankly saying what they say. They prepare themselves to be alternative army of Belarus. And I think
Alina,
that
I'm going to stop you there. Sorry, in the interest of time. Sorry, I'm sure there is. We're all very interested, but I am conscious of time running. Kirsty, very telegraphically to you on these two issues.
Thanks. Well, 2014, let's not forget that the economic sanctions against Russia came only in August as a result of MH17 and not as a result of the annexation of Crimea. So the response was really coming slowly, and the message that Russia got, as it got also in 2008, was that by using force, it can actually achieve its strategic goals, and then it pushed forward. So I think in that regard, February 2022 really made a difference, and now the approach is different. On Belarus, as Alina was saying, I mean, Belarusian society is different from Russian society. This is what we've seen when there were the massive protests against Lukashenko, and also when it comes to attitudes towards Russia's war against Ukraine. So the moment of Ukraine's victory will then be also the moment, the window of opportunity for Belarus to change. I think it's really tied to Ukraine. And when it comes to Europe's role, the EU's role in past and future, we need to have also a kind of not exaggerate our own influence on these countries and on these societies. Transformations towards democracy or away from it happen primarily as a result of domestic factors.
Indeed.
And then we have to recognize and read these factors well in the EU and among partner countries, but we can't really have a decisive impact in one way or the other.
Thank you for that,
Thanks.
Christy. Wrapping up, I have one last question each for Dick Zandi and Gustav Lindström, since we have none from the floor, from online. Telegraphically, Dick Zandi, is the European Union now on a trajectory to being a military power?
The simple answer is no. This is unlikely to happen. I don't believe in a European army simply because we are too divided in Europe. And a Finn won't speak Portuguese, a Norwegian or a Swede in this case will not speak Greek. We are moving into very much closer defense cooperation in Europe. That is a good thing we should cherish, and the war in Ukraine should be used for enhancing that further. But Europe will not become a military power on its own for decades, I think.
Thank you very much for that. And Gustav, last but not least, will the strategic compass and the strategic concept become irrelevant in 5 or 10 years is a question from Slido. So I think we've heard on that, but maybe your final word on it.
So actually, Benedetta should speak on the strategic concept, but I would just have to say these are hopefully living documents. So you have got to keep looking at them, monitoring them, updating them. So the hope would be, no, let's hope that these do not become outdated. But right now they're looking 5 to 10 years. And of course, there's always a need to keep looking at how the world is changing and how to adapt. So my simple answer would be, over time, of course, you need to sharpen these documents. And if you don't do so, there is a great risk that they become less relevant. But if we have the mechanisms there to keep them updated and also to modify them, it should be okay.
Thank you for this. So for those looking to the future, we have not new documents, but documents continuing their lives, being updated, and most importantly, actions to look to. Our time is now really up. I want to thank our panelists. I also have to say thank you to the organizers for giving me the challenge of 5 speakers in 55 minutes compared to everyone else who had 2. So I hope I will have your leniency in having run over. But I think we can all agree a lot was said. We've been pointed to the right direction on what to watch with regard to the victory of Ukraine that we hope will happen soon, and what is the day after going to look like. Once again, a warm thank you to the audience, to the organizers, and I am tasked with informing you that the next panel will be on the Indo-Pacific, security and defense, transatlantic relations with regard to that region. But first, I think there is lunch. Yes, so please enjoy the lunch and be back at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you.